The last thing I remembered before the silence hit was the slow metallic drip from the air conditioner and the chilling realization that the door lock I swore I had engaged was now silently clicking back into the unlocked position. My name is Ethan, and last summer, I was driving coast, mapping out potential new office locations for a logistics company. It was a tedious, solitary drive that took me through the desolate backroads of western Oklahoma, far from any interstate comfort. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was desperate for a bed. The place I found was called the Oasis Motel. It was less of an oasis, and more of a cracked asphalt island surrounded by The neon sign was missing the O end, off of DS, buzzing a dismal, stuttering rhythm into the twilight. The owner was a man named Silas Stahl, gaunt and impossibly quiet. His eyes seemed to look past me, focused somewhere distant and dusty. The check-in process was conducted in profound silence, broken only by the scratch of his pen in a vast, leather-bound register. He handed me a single, heavy brass key stamped with the number 9. "End of the row," he muttered, finally meeting my gaze. His voice was dry, like old parchment. "Don't bother the neighbors." Room 9 was at the very edge of the property. The moment I inserted the key, I noticed the door already felt warm to the touch. The lock mechanism groaned, and I stepped inside. The room smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke and something sweeter, almost floral, like dried potpourri. It was small, painted a faded turquoise, and dimly lit by a single bulb. I dropped my duffel bag and turned to survey the space. That's when I noticed the details that made my stomach turn cold. On the nightstand, resting beside the motor-issued lamp, was a pair of elegant, antique opera glasses. They looked utterly out of place, covered in dust, but clearly expensive. Beside them, tucked under the telephone, was a neatly folded linen handkerchief, the fabric yellow, with a faint, almost invisible monogram etched into the corner. I checked the closet. It was empty, save for 3 wire hangers. I checked the bathroom. Clean. But the most unsettling discovery was in the small armchair. Draped over the back, as if the owner had just stood up, was a lightweight linen suit jacket. It was a soft ivory color, terribly out of style, but meticulously clean. It was draped with a precise, almost loving care. I immediately went to the phone and called the front office. Silas answered after 3 long, ringing tones. "Room 9, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I think there's been a mistake. The room hasn't been cleaned, or the maid missed some things. There are personal belongings in her jacket. Glasses, ... double quotes." There was a heavy, static-less silence on the line. "No mistake, Mr. Ethan," Silas said, his voice flat. "That room was ready. But who did these belong to? They're still here." Silas let out a sigh that sounded like sand pouring from a pitcher. "The previous guest, sir, he paid for the night, nearly 30 years ago. He just ... never left the premises." The line clicked dead. I hung up, my hand shaking. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't an eccentric caretaker. This was deliberate. I went back to the armchair. I reached out and touched the jacket. It wasn't cold. It was warm, retaining an impossible body heat. As my fingers brushed the linen, I heard it, a low, scraping sound. Not from the window or the door, but from the floor, directly under the bed. It was the sound of something heavy being slowly dragged across the cheap carpet squares. I froze, listening. The scraping stopped. A new sound replaced it. A faint, almost inaudible cough, muffled, as if someone were covering their mouth with a pillow. It came from the corner where the bathroom met the outer wall. I realized I wasn't alone in the room. The previous guest was still here, and he was acknowledging my presence. My heart hammered against my ribs. I snatched my keys and duffel bag, moving toward the door. I had to get out. But as I reached the door, I glanced back at the nightstand. The opera glasses, which I had clearly seen pointing toward the window, were now slowly, agonizingly turning. They were moving on their own, swiveling until the large, glassy lenses were aimed directly at me. The movement was too slow to be a vibration, too smooth to be a coincidence. It was a conscious, intent gaze, observing my panic. I didn't wait to see more. I wrenched the door open and bolted, slamming the heavy brass key onto the ground outside before jumping into my car. I drove until the Oasis Motel was a distant blur of buzzing, broken neon. I pulled over 10 miles down the road, gasping for air. It was on until I reached for my jacket that I noticed it, neatly folded and tucked into the passenger side visor. Replacing my sunglasses was the antique linen handkerchief from room 9. The delicate, monogrammed initial was now facing me. He had left the premises, after all, and he was riding shotgun. The shadow didn't move, but the 2 perfectly round pinpricks of darkness carved into the vent grill seemed to blink, and I realized whatever was up there was Auntie just watching it, was waiting for me to look away. We were 3 days into a miserable cross-country move when exhaustion finally won. We weren't looking for luxury, just somewhere safe to pull the U-Haul and park the baby for a few hours of sleep. The place we found was called the Starlight Inn, a rambling 2-story structure, miles from any major town. The owner, a woman with tired eyes and a floral nightgown, gave us the key to room 14. She apologized for the smell, mumbling something about the air conditioning unit being old. The room itself was typical. 2 double beds, fake wood paneling, and a pervasive, dusty odor that defied the blast of cheap, recycled cold air. We quickly set up the pack-and-play for our 7-month-old daughter, Clara, in the corner near the window. It was around 1 a.m., and we had just settled into bed when the first sound came. It was a soft, continuous scraping noise, faint but distinct, coming from above the ceiling. My wife, Sarah, elbowed me gently. "What is that?" "A rodent." "Has to be," I whispered, pulling the thin sheet over my shoulder. "Old building, just ignore it." But the sound wasn't the frantic scurrying of mice. It was slow, methodical, and seemed to be moving across the length of the room, parallel to the ceiling fan. It sounded like someone dragging a sack of potatoes across rough insulation. After 10 minutes, the noise intensified and then stopped directly above us, settling into an unnerving silence. Then, Clara started to fuss, not crying, just a low, irritated whimper. I got up, shushed her, and checked her temperature. She was fine. I rocked her until she was quiet, then returned to bed. The moment my head hit the pillow, the noise resumed. But now it was different. It wasn't scraping. It was a rhythmic, almost deliberate ticking, like a fingernail gently tapping plastic, coming from the ceiling directly above Clara's pack-and-play. Sarah sat bolt upright. "That's not a mouse, Ethan. That sounds like someone's tapping." Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced my exhaustion. I crept to Clara's crib, holding my breath. The tapping stopped the instant I was near the crib, but the air around that corner felt noticeably colder, heavy with a damp, metallic smell. I looked up at the ceiling. There was a single, large air vent grill, dusty and slightly bowed, set into the plaster ceiling directly above where Clara lay sleeping. The vent was the source. I decided I had to look. My parental instinct overruled my common sense. I moved the heavy armchair from the corner, dragged the laminate desk beneath the vent, and climbed onto it, bringing my phone for light. The vent grill was thick, molded plastic, secured by 4 heavily rusted screws. I held my phone up, shining the beam directly onto the grill. Dust motes danced in the stark light. It was then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just dirt accumulation or poor molding, but under the intense light, the details became horrifyingly clear. Across 2 of the central slats of the grill, 2 small, dark holes had been carved. They weren't drilled. They were gouged out, rough around the edges, as if slowly worked with the tip of a knife or a sharp piece of metal. They were spaced exactly the width of a person's eyes. My blood ran cold. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought Sarah would hear it across the room. I was looking into the ceiling cavity, but the holes weren't meant for ventilation. They were peepholes, and they were looking directly down at Clara's crib. I could see nothing inside the vent, only absolute inky blackness that seemed to absorb the light from my phone. But I knew, with a certainty that turned my knees to water, that something was in the crawlspace, watching. I slowly lowered the phone, hiding the light. I heard Sarah gasp behind me. "Ethan, what is it? What did you see?" I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, keeping my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I reached out a trembling hand and pressed it hard against the plastic grill. As I did, I felt a faint, opposing pressure from the inside, a light, reciprocal push against my palm. The tapping began again, no longer coming from the vent, but from the wall, nearest Clara's crib, low to the ground. Tap. 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 It was a distraction. Whatever was in the ceiling knew I had seen its observation post, and it was drawing my attention away from the vent, giving itself time to move. I scrambled off the desk, my legs barely holding me. "We're leaving," I choked out, grabbing Clara from the crib. "Now. Don't look up. Just grab the essentials. We're going." We were out of room 14 within 90 seconds, fleeing into the cool, silent night. I didn't even look back at the room. We drove until we reached the next brightly lit, 24-hour gas station, where we parked and tried to breathe. Later, shivering in the passenger seat with Clara pressed against my chest, Sarah tried to rationalize its old hotel, previous eccentric guest, just a structural flaw. I listened, but I knew the truth. I looked down at my hand, the one that had pressed against the vent. A faint, dusty black residue covered my palm. As I wiped it away, I realized a small, brittle fragment of molded plastic had been stuck to my skin. It was curved, thin, and the color of the old vent grill. It was one of the small, crudely carved crescent moons of plastic, the kind that would be displaced when gouging out a hole, and it had fallen onto my hand when the watcher in the dark had pressed back. The last thing I remembered before pulling away from the motel was the heavy silence of the night, and the chilling realization that whatever had been watching Clara had finally shed a piece of itself, and I had brought it with me. The low hum of the machine was the only sound in the desert night, but when I looked closer I saw the reflection of a silhouette standing behind me in the glass, and it was holding out an empty pack. My name is Ryan, and my worst experiences always seem to happen when I am chasing a cheap room and a cold soda. This time, I was driving through the Mojave, and when my car started making unhappy noises, I pulled off the highway and into the parking lot of the Starlight Oasis, a motel that clearly hadn't been an oasis since 1985. The air was thick, dry, and tasted of dust and engine heat. The clerk, a sleepy woman who smelled strongly of lavender and stale coffee, barely looked up when she handed me the key to room 5. After settling my bag, I realized my travel cooler was empty. I needed caffeine badly. I asked the clerk about vending machines. "Only one works," she mumbled, pointing vaguely towards the end of the parking lot, near a set of abandoned laundry facilities. "It's temperamental, but it usually takes coins." I walked toward the designated spot. The machine was a huge, archaic box, painted a sickly shade of yellow, half hidden in the shadow of a flickering security light. It was clearly the oldest piece of equipment on the property. I pulled out my wallet, ready for a soda, but stopped dead when I saw the contents of the machine. There were no sodas, no chips, no candy bars. Every single column, from top to bottom, was stocked exclusively with the exact same item: Raleigh cigarettes, and not a modern pack, either. These were the vintage, white hand-read boxers, dusty and faded, looking like they'd been in that machine since the late 70s. I was baffled. Who stocks an entire vending machine solely with one obscure, decades-old brand of cigarettes? I checked the price. The small metal sticker read $0.75, a profound anachronism. Shaking my head, I decided to head back to the car for water. As I turned to leave, I noticed something resting on the dusty concrete directly in front of the machine's coin slot. It was a small, neat pile of quarters and dimes. Exactly 3 quarters 75 cents. The exact cost of a pack of Raleighs. I looked around the empty parking lot. No cars were moving. No one was outside. I knew I hadn't dropped them. It was a careful offering. Maybe someone was just frustrated and left their change. Premeditated myself pocketing the coins. I went back to my room, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on my neck. An hour later, I was back. I was desperate for something cold, and the motel's ice machine was broken. As I approached the yellow machine, my flashlight beam hit the ground. Another pile of change. Again, precisely 75 cents. This time, the coins looked cleaner, newer, as if they had just been handled. My hands started to sweat. I looked back at the motel room doors. All were closed. I was completely alone. I slowly knelt down, not touching the coins, and shined my light into the glass of the machine. I could clearly see the dusty, identical packs of Raleighs lining the columns. The machine wasn't working. It was feeding. I decided to play along. I pulled out my own wallet, took out 75 cents, and added it to the pile. I then took a step back and waited in the shadow, holding my breath. I waited for 10 agonizing minutes. Nothing. Just the faint, high-pitched whine of the machine's old gears cycling power. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a sound that made my chest seize up. It was a light, brittle rattle coming from inside the machine. It sounded like someone lightly shaking an empty pack of cigarettes. Then, a faint, dry whisper, barely audible over the machine's hum, seemed to leak out of the change slot. It wasn't a word, just a soft, drawn-out, a sound of subtle, deep disappointment. I watched frozen as one of the stacks of Raleighs in the display column, the one labeled B3, seemed to shift slightly, dipping lower than the others, as if a hand had reached up from beneath and grabbed the bottom pack. The machine hadn't taken my coins, but it had registered that the offering was wrong. It wasn't a correct payment, or it wasn't the correct person making the payment. I knew then. The coins weren't an offering to the machine. They were a payment for something inside it, left by a meticulous, invisible patron who expected to be served. I scrambled back to my room, locking the door and shoving a chair beneath the handle. I was terrified of the dark, but more terrified of the light shining on the floor under the coin slot. The next morning, I checked out before dawn. I kept my head down and didn't mention the machine to the clerk. As I was pulling out of the parking lot, I couldn't resist one last glance at the yellow box. In the early morning light, I saw the 3 quarters I had added, still sitting untouched on the concrete, but the original 75 cents I had pocketed was missing, and resting right beside my untouched quarters was a single, dusty, vintage pack of Raleighs. It was slightly crushed, and the cellophane wrapper had been torn open. The machine had completed the transaction. The previous patron had received their item, and they had left their empty, silent thanks right where I had left the offering. I slammed the gas pedal and didn't look back. But even now, when I reach into my pocket, I always check the change, half expecting to find 3 quarters of very specific, very insistent payment waiting for me. That's where we closed the door on the forgotten motels tonight. Whether it was a presence watching through the air vent, the demand of a dark ritual at a vending machine, or the guest who simply refused to leave, the horror demands a price. If these tales struck a nerve, tap that like button and share your own story in the comments. To ensure you never miss the next journey into the world's truest terrors, be sure to subscribe. Until next time, when you pull off the main road, remember to check the lock twice, because some travelers never truly leave. Sleet well.